The small settlement sat on the edge of a wide, barren plain. Dust swirled constantly in the wind, carrying with it the faint smell of dry earth and the faint echo of distant conflicts. Life here had never been easy. The people were used to hardship, to stretching every resource they had and to relying on one another. Still, despite the challenges, they had always managed to survive. They farmed what little land was fertile, hunted what animals roamed the outskirts, and traded with passing merchants. But over the past few months, things had started to change. Rumors began to circulate of strange forces moving in the surrounding lands. Raiders, mercenaries, and unknown factions had begun to appear in increasing numbers. At first, the settlement's defenders tried to repel them with what little force they had. The militia was made up mostly of ordinary people who had learned to wield a sword or a spear, who had learned the value of courage under pressure, but had no real training in organized warfare. Every encounter had been tense, every skirmish costly. And with each passing day, the danger grew. The leaders of the settlement, men and women who had spent their lives protecting their home, knew that something had to be done. They gathered in the central hall, a modest building of stone and wood where the air was thick with the smell of smoke from the hearth. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters and whispered across the empty streets as if reminding them that time was running out. They spoke quietly at first, exchanging reports from scouts and messengers. Each report made the situation clearer but also more terrifying. "We can't hold out much longer," one of the elders said, his voice low and heavy with worry. "They are coming in larger numbers every day. We are barely keeping our perimeter intact." Another spoke up, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "We need reinforcements. Something stronger, something that can fight them off before they reach our walls." The room fell silent. It was one thing to think about reinforcements in theory, another entirely to actually ask for help. For generations, the settlement had relied on itself, proud of its independence and resilience. Asking for outside assistance was not something they had done often, and it carried a weight that none of them took lightly. Finally, a consensus emerged. They would send a call for help. It would be a request for aid for soldiers, weapons, and advice. It was not a guaranteed solution, but it was the only option left. Messengers were prepared, and a signal was sent across the wider lands, reaching those who could provide assistance. The hope was cautious but real. Perhaps they would receive a small force to bolster their defenses, perhaps even a few experienced fighters who could guide them. The days that followed were tense. Every shadow, every movement across the plain was scrutinized. The people of the settlement went about their routines but with a weight on their shoulders. Children played quietly, adults worked silently, and the militia drilled and practiced as best they could. Fear was no longer an occasional visitor. It had become a constant companion, sitting at every table and standing at every doorway. Then, without warning, a new presence appeared on the horizon. At first, it was just a glimmer of movement, too far away to understand. The scouts sent to investigate returned with reports that made even the hardened leaders pause. The reinforcements were not what anyone had expected. A fleet approached, not of small squads or ordinary soldiers, but of immense towering figures. These were the Warworlders, beings who seemed to be forged for battle itself. Their appearance was striking, almost terrifying, and their movements were precise, almost mechanical in their efficiency. They were unlike any reinforcements the settlement had imagined, and their presence instantly changed the atmosphere of the settlement. Relief mixed with fear. The first Warworlders stepped onto the ground, their boots heavy, their eyes scanning every corner of the settlement with sharp awareness. They did not speak immediately, but their silence carried weight. People watched, uncertain whether to flee or to approach. Slowly, a leader from the Warworlders stepped forward, nodding once to acknowledge the elders. That single gesture carried reassurance and authority all at once. The Warworlders began to assess the situation immediately. They moved through the settlement, noting the condition of the walls, the positions of the defenders, and the natural terrain surrounding the town. Their methods were unfamiliar. They measured, they analyzed, they pointed, and they instructed. Where the local militia had relied on tradition and instinct, the Warworlders relied on strategy, efficiency, and sheer force. Their presence was a revelation. Over the next few days, the Warworlders integrated with the local forces. They trained the militia relentlessly, often pushing them to their limits. The exercises were intense, designed to break old habits and replace them with new, more effective techniques. At first, many villagers resisted. Their methods seemed harsh, even cruel. But gradually they began to see results. Where once the militia had faltered, now they moved with precision. Where once fear had paralyzed them, they now acted with confidence. Life in the settlement began to change. Streets that had been quiet and cautious now buzzed with purposeful activity. Barricades were reinforced, watchtowers repaired, and supply lines organized. Even the children could sense the difference. Their parents were no longer anxious and uncertain. They were focused, prepared, and determined. The presence of the Warworlders, while intimidating, had instilled a sense of order that the settlement had never experienced before. But not everyone was comfortable with this change. Some elders whispered privately, worried that in gaining strength they might lose something else. Their traditions, their ways of life, even their sense of normalcy were being challenged. The Warworlders did not understand these worries. They cared only for the effectiveness of the settlement's defense. Yet over time, even the skeptics began to recognize the necessity of their methods. Then one evening, the settlement's scouts returned with alarming news. A large force was approaching from the horizon, larger than anything they had seen before. Panic threatened to return, but the Warworlders were ready. They gathered the militia and civilians, instructing them calmly but firmly. Every movement was directed, every position assigned. The settlement was no longer a cluster of frightened villagers. It had become a coordinated, prepared community, capable of defending itself. As night fell, the first skirmishes began. The Warworlders led the charge, striking with precision and overwhelming force. The villagers watched in awe and in fear as the unknown reinforcements showed their true power. The battle was fierce, but for the first time in months the people felt a glimmer of hope. They realized that the reinforcements they had asked for were not ordinary. They were something far stronger, far more capable than they had ever imagined. By the time the first light of dawn broke, the attackers had been pushed back. Their numbers diminished. Their morale shattered. The settlement had survived the night. Exhausted, battered, but alive, the people looked at the Warworlders with a mix of gratitude and awe. These beings had changed everything in a single night. The settlement would never be the same again. They had asked for help, and what they had received was more than help. It was a force of nature, a glimpse of raw strength that none could ignore. As the Warworlders stood among them, surveying the results of the battle, the people realized that the road ahead would be different. They would face new challenges, new threats, but they were no longer alone. The settlement had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And though the Warworlders were mysterious and sometimes frightening, one truth was clear: they had come for a reason, and that reason was survival. For the people of the settlement, the story of that night would be told for generations. It was a story of fear and hope, of desperation and strength, and of a force that had arrived when it was most needed, though in a form none had expected. The day after the battle, the settlement was quiet but alive with a new energy. The people moved with purpose, repairing what had been damaged, tending to the wounded, and organizing supplies. The Warworlders were already at work, walking through the streets with deliberate steps, their eyes scanning everything, noting weaknesses and strengths alike. Their presence was overwhelming, yet there was a strange comfort in it. For the first time in months, the villagers felt that they had a chance. The first Warworlder to speak formally to the leaders was a tall, broad figure with armor that seemed almost fused with his skin. His voice was deep, carrying weight and authority. "Your settlement is vulnerable," he said. "We will remain until you can defend yourselves. Until then, you follow our instructions." The leaders exchanged nervous glances. The Warworlders were not subtle. They did not offer comfort or negotiate, they commanded. But their confidence was infectious. Slowly, the leaders began to realize that their people could trust them, if only because their skill and experience were undeniable. The next hours were filled with observation. The Warworlders inspected the walls, the gates, and the watchtowers. They examined the terrain around the settlement, noting where ambushes could happen or where attackers might try to breach. They marked areas for fortifications and gave instructions that seemed strange at first. Barricades were reinforced not only at the gates but also along narrow alleys and hidden pathways. Trenches were dug where none had existed, and observation points were established in places that had been overlooked for generations. At first, the villagers were hesitant. They had spent their lives defending their home in a certain way. They knew where the danger usually came from and how to handle it. But the Warworlders had eyes and knowledge far beyond theirs. Where the villagers saw walls, the Warworlders saw weak points. Where the villagers saw safety, the Warworlders saw opportunity for attack. Their perspective was unsettling, yet undeniably effective. Then came the training. Every able-bodied villager, from young adults to seasoned fighters, was brought to the open field outside the settlement. The Warworlders demonstrated combat techniques that were foreign to them. Movements were faster, more precise, almost unnatural in their efficiency. Every step, every strike, every stance was deliberate. The villagers struggled to keep up at first, stumbling over their own habits and instincts. "You must move as one Warworlder instructed, his voice firm but not cruel. Confusion kills. Hesitation kills. Strength alone is not enough." The villagers practiced endlessly, sweat pouring down their faces, muscles burning, but slowly, they began to understand. They began to move more as a unit rather than individuals. They began to anticipate each other's actions, learning to trust not only themselves but also the presence and guidance of the Warworlders. Food and rest were scarce, but discipline was strict. The Warworlders ate sparingly, moved without complaint, and slept in shifts to ensure someone was always watching. Their stamina was remarkable, and their endurance inspired the villagers. People who had once doubted their own strength began to push themselves further, fueled by the Warworlders' example. It wasn't only physical training. The Warworlders taught strategy, showing the villagers how to anticipate enemy movements and plan responses before the danger arrived. They used the terrain, natural obstacles, and even the weather to their advantage. They drilled the villagers in communication techniques, signaling systems, and ways to coordinate attacks silently and effectively. The villagers began to notice changes in themselves. Fear still existed, but it was tempered by a growing confidence. Tasks that had once seemed impossible were now manageable. They moved through the settlement with purpose, carrying out assignments and preparing defenses with a calm efficiency they had never known. Parents felt safer sending their children to school or to help in fields because they could trust that the Warworlders had prepared them for threats. Yet the Warworlders were not gentle. Mistakes were met with correction, often harshly. Villagers stumbled under their supervision, and there was no sugarcoating failure. Some people struggled to keep up and felt frustrated or even ashamed, but over time the corrections became lessons and the lessons became skills. Confidence replaced frustration, and fear began to shift from panic to cautious respect. The settlement began to take on a different rhythm. The sound of hammering, shouting, and drills filled the air. Streets that had once been quiet now buzzed with preparation and activity. Children watched from doorways, fascinated by the precision and power of the Warworlders. Even the elderly, who had worried that the settlement would never recover, began to smile quietly at the progress. They saw their younger people growing stronger, more capable, more resilient. Despite the improvements, tension still lingered. The villagers could see the scale of the threat that had been approaching. They had been spared once, but they knew it might return in greater numbers. The Warworlders' presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the danger outside. Every day, scouts reported movements on the horizon, and every day the Warworlders adjusted strategies, reinforced positions, and trained the villagers for what might come. One morning, the settlement awoke to find the Warworlders leading the villagers in a simulation of a full-scale attack. Smoke filled the air as fires were set to create obstacles. Sounds of battle echoed as villagers defended positions under the watchful eyes of the Warworlders. The simulation was exhausting and intimidating, yet it worked. By the end of the day, the villagers were tired, dirty, and sore, but they had learned more than they could have imagined. Coordination, strategy, and strength had all improved dramatically in a single day. Small victories began to build morale. A group of villagers who had been struggling to coordinate earlier successfully repelled a mock attack in perfect synchronization. Their smiles were wide, their hearts full. Even the Warworlders allowed a rare nod of approval. "You are learning," one said simply, and though the words were few, the meaning was clear. Progress was being made. Through it all, the villagers started to see the Warworlders differently. They were no longer just mysterious warriors. They were teachers, guides, and protectors. They were hard, unyielding, and sometimes frightening, but their methods were saving lives. The villagers began to respect them not only for their strength, but also for their knowledge. Trust grew slowly but firmly, and a bond began to form, one forged not by words but by shared struggle and purpose. At night, when the drills were over and the settlement was quiet, people would gather in small groups to talk. They spoke about the changes, the fears, and the victories. Parents spoke of pride in their children, elders spoke of hope renewed, and young fighters spoke of confidence they had never felt before. Though the Warworlders were not part of these conversations, their influence was everywhere, a silent presence that shaped every thought and action. As the days passed, the villagers began to understand a new truth. The reinforcements they had received were not ordinary. These were not just soldiers sent to protect them. They were Warworlders, beings designed for war, for strategy, for survival. Their methods were harsh, their expectations high, but the results were undeniable. The settlement was becoming stronger, safer, and more organized than it had ever been. The horizon still held uncertainty. The enemy could return at any time, and the threat had not vanished. But for the first time in months, the villagers felt ready. They had learned to fight together, to anticipate danger, and to rely not only on themselves but on the strength and guidance of the Warworlders. Hope, once fragile, had grown into something solid, something capable of withstanding even the heaviest storm. The Warworlders did not celebrate or rest. They continued to observe, train, and adjust strategies, but the villagers no longer feared them. Instead, they watched, learned, and grew. By working together, they had begun to transform not just the settlement's defenses, but also themselves. Fear was still present, but courage and skill were now stronger companions. And so the settlement waited, prepared, and learned. Every day brought progress, and every night brought reflection. The villagers had asked for reinforcements, expecting help, but what they had received was far beyond their imagination. The Warworlders were more than soldiers. They were a force that would shape their lives, challenge their limits, and prepare them for the battles yet to come. The settlement had changed forever, and the people knew that the days ahead would be unlike anything they had ever faced. Yet for the first time they were ready, not just to survive, but to fight, to defend, and to endure. The first signs of the approaching threat appeared as faint shapes on the horizon, barely visible in the morning haze. The villagers had grown used to watching the distant planes, and their hearts raced at the sight. Scouts returned quickly, bringing reports that the enemy was larger than anyone had anticipated. Tension gripped the settlement, but it was different from before. Now it was tempered by preparation and a growing confidence that had come from days of training under the Warworlders. The Warworlders moved silently through the settlement, their presence a constant reminder that action was needed. They directed the villagers to their positions with short, clear commands. There was no arguing, no hesitation, only movement, practice, and focus. Barricades were manned, gates were reinforced, and every path that could be used by attackers was carefully watched. For the first time, the villagers truly understood what it meant to defend not just a home, but a community. The enemy force drew closer, and the Warworlders gathered the villagers for a final briefing. They did not speak in long speeches. They did not offer encouragement in the way a human leader might. Instead, they pointed, demonstrated, and showed. Every instruction was clear: where to stand, how to respond, how to move together as a single unit. Panic had no place here. Fear had no place here. Only discipline, awareness, and trust in one another. The villagers took their positions, hearts pounding, hands gripping weapons. They glanced at each other, exchanging silent encouragement. Some were young, barely trained, yet they carried themselves with a newfound determination. Others were older, once doubtful, now ready to follow orders without hesitation. Even those who had been skeptical of the Warworlders' methods now understood the wisdom behind their guidance. The first clash came suddenly. A small group of the enemy tested the defenses, moving faster than expected. The villagers reacted immediately, blocking the approaches they had practiced countless times. Their movements were coordinated, their timing precise. The Warworlders led from the front, striking with overwhelming force and demonstrating tactics that were both unfamiliar and effective. Some villagers hesitated at first, fear creeping into their movements, but the presence of the Warworlders beside them calmed them. The Warworlders did not speak words of comfort. They did not need to. Their sheer strength and skill communicated more than words ever could. When a villager faltered, a Warworlder would cover, correct, and guide. Every mistake became a lesson, and every success, no matter how small, was a building block of confidence. The battle intensified. Larger groups of the enemy approached, and the villagers found themselves moving faster, thinking quicker, reacting more sharply than ever before. The techniques they had learned, the formations, the signals, the coordinated movements were now being tested under real conditions. It was frightening, exhausting, and exhilarating all at once. They were not just defending walls. They were learning to become a single, united force. Children who watched from hidden corners felt a mixture of fear and awe. They had seen the enemy before, had heard the stories of raids and attacks, but never had they imagined that their home could withstand such pressure. The villagers' faces reflected a determination the children could sense. There was courage now where there had once been panic. There was strength where there had once been doubt. As the hours passed, the villagers adapted. They began to anticipate enemy movements, predicting attacks and responding almost instinctively. The Warworlders moved among them, correcting mistakes quickly and silently, adjusting strategies as needed. Every maneuver was calculated, every action precise. The villagers started to feel a strange rhythm in the chaos of battle, a sense that they were no longer overwhelmed but in control, even if only partially. A turning point came when a group of the enemy tried to flank the settlement from the east, where the wall was thinner and less guarded. A small unit of villagers, guided by a Warworlder, intercepted the attackers. At first, their movements were clumsy, but as they followed instructions, they formed an unbroken line, pushing the enemy back with coordinated strikes. For the first time, they realized the power of teamwork guided by skill and experience. The day stretched long, filled with the sounds of clashing weapons, shouted commands, and the occasional cries of pain. Yet through it all, the villagers kept moving, guided by the Warworlders. They learned to read the battlefield, to anticipate danger, and to protect one another. Even those who had doubted themselves felt a growing sense of pride and capability. They were becoming fighters, not just survivors. By late afternoon, the enemy began to retreat, unable to break through the coordinated defenses. The villagers were exhausted, dirty, and bruised, but they were triumphant. The settlement had held. The first real test had been terrifying, but it had also proven that the training, the discipline, and the presence of the Warworlders had worked. After the battle, the villagers tended to the wounded and repaired the defenses. The Warworlders inspected the results, offering corrections and adjustments silently, their expressions unreadable. The villagers, however, were not discouraged by the critiques. They understood that this was part of the process. Improvement came through honest assessment, and survival depended on learning from every encounter. That night, the settlement was quiet but alive with reflection. The villagers gathered in small groups, sharing stories of what had happened during the day. They spoke of fear and courage, of mistakes and successes, of moments when they had felt ready to give up but had pressed on. Even those who had been skeptical of the Warworlders admitted that they could no longer imagine defending the settlement without them. In the quiet hours, a young villager stood on a hill overlooking the settlement. The fires from the battle had left smoldering patches across the fields, and the wind carried the smell of smoke and earth. They watched the Warworlders moving silently through the streets, checking positions and ensuring that everything was in order. There was something almost otherworldly about their presence, a calmness amidst chaos that the villagers could not replicate. Yet there was also reassurance. The settlement had survived because of them. Over the next few days, the Warworlders continued to train the villagers, but the focus shifted slightly. It was no longer just preparation, it was refinement. Movements became faster, signals more precise, and coordination tighter. The villagers were learning not just to defend themselves but to think like the Warworlders, to anticipate, to act, and to adapt. Fear was still present, but it had changed. It was no longer paralyzing, it was a tool, a warning to stay alert and aware. The bond between the Warworlders and the villagers deepened. It was not friendship in the way the villagers had known, but respect, trust, and shared purpose. The Warworlders were still formidable and sometimes frightening, but the villagers had come to understand them. They saw that their methods, though harsh, were necessary. They saw that their strength was not just physical but also strategic, and that survival depended on learning from them. The settlement began to feel like a new place. Streets that had been empty and quiet were now bustling with activity, but there was a sense of order and purpose. Every villager had a role, every action was meaningful, and every person contributed to the safety of the whole. The fear of the enemy had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by a growing confidence and understanding. The villagers were no longer simply waiting for the next attack, they were ready for it. The Warworlders, ever silent and ever watchful, continued their work. They drilled the villagers, corrected mistakes, and adjusted strategies as needed. The villagers, in turn, grew stronger, faster, and more confident. They learned to rely not only on the Warworlders but also on each other, understanding that survival depended on unity and coordination as much as strength. As night fell, the settlement stood strong. The first real test had been survived, and the villagers knew that more challenges would come. But for the first time, they felt capable of facing them. The Warworlders had changed everything. Not only had they provided protection, but they had also transformed the villagers into a community capable of defending itself. Fear had not vanished, but courage, skill, and unity had grown in its place, and so, the settlement rested, prepared for whatever came next, knowing that they were no longer the same people who had sent that desperate call for help. They were stronger, wiser, and ready to face the trials ahead with the guidance of the Warworlders and the courage that had grown within them. The story of their first real battle and the lessons learned would be remembered for years to come, a reminder that even in the darkest times, preparation, unity, and guidance could turn fear into strength. The following days were tense, filled with a mix of preparation, training, and the constant hum of unease. Scouts continued to report enemy movements across the plains, and the villagers had grown accustomed to the anxious rhythm of waiting. Yet, unlike before, the waiting now carried purpose. Every action, every task, every drill served a reason. The Warworlders had transformed the settlement into a place of discipline and readiness. Early one morning, the horizon darkened with movement. This time the enemy force was larger, organized, and far more aggressive than before. It was clear they were not testing the settlement, they were coming to take it by force. Alarm bells rang across the town, but the villagers did not panic. They moved swiftly to their positions, weapons ready, hearts racing but focused. The Warworlders walked among them, eyes sharp, hands adjusting positions, correcting stances, and giving orders with precision. The first clash came at the outer perimeter. The enemy charged with ferocity, expecting fear, confusion, and disarray. What they met instead was something entirely unexpected. The villagers moved as one. They anticipated the attacks, blocked paths, and countered with strikes learned under the Warworlders' guidance. Their movements were faster, more coordinated, and more confident than ever before. A group of villagers on the eastern flank found themselves facing a larger enemy squad than they had trained for. At first, hesitation flickered through their ranks, but a Warworlder appeared beside them, placing a strong guiding hand on the shoulder of the group's leader. Without words, the gesture conveyed calm, strength, and direction. The villagers moved forward together, striking with precision and forcing the enemy to fall back. Every part of the settlement became a battlefield, but also a demonstration of new skills. Barricades were manned efficiently, pathways were covered, and signals passed quickly from one group to another. The villagers' hearts pounded with fear, yes, but also with determination. For the first time, they truly understood what it meant to defend not only themselves but everyone around them. The battle raged on through the day. There were moments when the enemy broke through a small section of the defense, moments of panic and confusion, but the Warworlders were always there, steadying the villagers, guiding their actions, and turning potential disasters into learning opportunities. Mistakes were corrected quickly, sometimes with harshness but always with results. The villagers began to adapt, improvising in ways they never had before. One turning point came when a group of the enemy attempted a surprise maneuver, trying to bypass the main defenses and strike at the heart of the settlement. Scouts shouted warnings and villagers reacted immediately. They moved as a single unit, forming lines and blocking the advance. A Warworlder led the charge to the front, striking with such force that the attackers faltered. The villagers followed instinctively, coordinating movements they had practiced countless times, and together they pushed back the threat. It was exhausting. By midday, the villagers were covered in sweat, dust, and grime. Their hands were blistered from holding weapons. Their muscles ached from constant movement, and yet they did not falter. Each time the enemy attacked, they responded more efficiently. Each clash taught them something new about strategy, timing, and coordination. Fear was still present, but it had transformed into a sharper awareness, a sense of readiness that had been absent before. The Warworlders were relentless. They moved among the villagers, correcting stances, adjusting positions, and sometimes stepping in directly to demonstrate a more effective approach. Villagers who had once doubted themselves began to trust not only the Warworlders, but also their own instincts. They learned to anticipate attacks, to cover one another, and to communicate in ways that were almost silent. Coordination became instinctive, almost natural, as if their bodies remembered lessons before their minds did. By late afternoon, the enemy began to falter. Their attacks, once overwhelming, were now met with organized resistance. Villagers who had been unsure of their abilities now struck with confidence. They covered each other, moved strategically, and even began to outmaneuver the attackers in some areas. The Warworlders observed silently, their presence a steady anchor in the chaos. The villagers realized that they were no longer fighting as individuals. They were part of a single, cohesive force. The turning point of the battle came when a major enemy squad attempted to break through the western gates, where the walls had been weakened in previous skirmishes. The villagers had anticipated this thanks to careful planning and observation. As the attackers surged forward, a line of villagers held their ground, supported by the Warworlders who struck with precision and strength. The enemy was pushed back and the western gate held firm. Cheers and shouts of triumph were muffled by the roar of ongoing combat. But inside the settlement, hope began to blossom. Even as victory approached, the cost was visible. Some villagers had been injured, some were exhausted, and many were shaken by the intensity of the battle. Yet there was a sense of pride, a feeling that they had endured, learned, and grown stronger. The Warworlders moved among them, checking positions, offering guidance, and silently acknowledging the villagers' progress. The people began to see themselves not as victims or simple defenders, but as capable fighters who had faced real danger and survived. As evening approached, the enemy began to retreat. Their formations were broken, their morale shaken, and their attempts to infiltrate the settlement had failed. The villagers, though exhausted, stood vigilant, watching the horizon for any signs of return. They knew that this victory was only one step in a long process of survival and preparation. Yet the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. After the battle, the Warworlders led the villagers in assessing the defenses, tending to the wounded, and planning for any future attacks. Mistakes were discussed and corrected, not to shame anyone, but to strengthen the settlement for the challenges ahead. The villagers, despite fatigue and pain, listened closely, eager to learn and improve. They had tasted both fear and triumph, and they understood that knowledge and preparation were their most valuable weapons. That night, the settlement was quiet, but alive with reflection. People moved among the streets, tending to fires, helping the wounded, and speaking softly about the day's events. Children huddled close to parents, listening to stories of bravery and coordination and slowly absorbing the lessons of the day. Even the elders, who had been skeptical of the Warworlders at first, acknowledged the transformation taking place. The Warworlders, ever vigilant, moved among the settlement silently. They did not sleep deeply, did not rest fully, and did not speak unnecessarily. Their focus was unwavering, their presence steady and commanding. Yet for the villagers, this presence had become reassuring. They had seen the Warworlders in action, had learned from them, and had come to understand the purpose behind their intensity. Trust had grown, not through words, but through shared experience. The battle had changed the settlement in profound ways. It was no longer simply a collection of homes and people. It had become a fortress of resilience, discipline, and unity. Villagers who had once doubted themselves now moved with confidence. Fear had not vanished, but it had been transformed into vigilance and awareness. The settlement had survived, and in doing so, had discovered strength they did not know they possessed. In the quiet hours of the night, a few villagers walked along the outer walls, looking at the horizon where the enemy had retreated. The plain stretched endlessly, empty but for shadows and distant movements. The villagers knew that this was not the end. More challenges would come, more enemies would approach, and more battles would have to be fought. Yet there was a profound sense of readiness. They were no longer the same people who had sent out a desperate call for reinforcements days ago. They were stronger, wiser and capable of defending themselves in ways they had never imagined. The Warworlders remained with the settlement, silent and unwavering. They continued to train, guide, and strengthen the villagers, preparing them for what lay ahead. The villagers had begun to internalize the lessons, moving and thinking in ways that reflected the Warworlders' guidance. They were no longer just followers. They were active participants in their survival, capable of making decisions, anticipating danger, and protecting one another. The settlement, once fragile and fearful, now stood as a symbol of resilience. Every wall, every barricade, every drilled villager represented preparation, knowledge, and courage. They had faced a force that had once seemed unstoppable and had survived. They had learned the value of strategy, discipline, and unity. And above all, they had learned that strength was not only physical, it was mental, emotional, and collective. As the stars appeared in the night sky, the villagers knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But they were ready. The Warworlders had not only guided them through the first major battle, they had transformed them into a community capable of facing the unknown. Fear would always exist, but now it was accompanied by courage, knowledge, and unity. The settlement had endured, and the people had grown stronger, ready to face whatever the future held. The morning after the battle dawned calm, almost deceptively so. The sun rose slowly over the settlement, casting a warm golden light on streets that were still scarred by the previous day's chaos. Smoke from small fires still lingered in patches across the fields, and the faint scent of blood and sweat hung in the air. Though the battle had been won, the villagers knew the cost had been high. The victory was real, but the consequences were unavoidable. The first task of the day was tending to the wounded. Every home, every alley, and even open spaces were filled with villagers nursing injuries. Some had deep cuts and bruises. Others had broken bones or sprains from falling or being struck. Pain and exhaustion were written on every face. Yet the villagers worked tirelessly to help each other. They cleaned wounds, applied makeshift bandages, and whispered words of comfort. In that labor, a sense of community deepened. Each act of care reminded them that survival was not only about fighting, it was about protecting each other. The Warworlders moved among them silently. They did not offer words of consolation, but their presence alone was steadying. Where a villager hesitated, unsure of how to help someone injured, a Warworlder would step in, demonstrating the correct way to carry a stretcher or stabilize a broken limb. Though their methods were efficient and sometimes harsh, the villagers began to see the wisdom in their actions. Pain could be managed, suffering could be minimized, and lives could be saved if people worked together under guidance. In the streets and squares, conversations were hushed, tinged with both relief and sorrow. Villagers spoke of comrades who had been injured more severely, and some spoke quietly of lives lost. The reality of war, they realized, could not be avoided. Even with preparation and guidance, the battle had left scars, both visible and invisible. They began to understand that survival came at a price, and that price was sometimes measured in human suffering. Yet, despite the sadness, there was pride. The villagers had defended their homes successfully. They had faced an enemy that had seemed overwhelming and had survived. Their actions, their courage, and their discipline under the guidance of the Warworlders had changed the outcome. For the first time, they felt capable of controlling their fate, of standing strong even when fear threatened to consume them. The lessons they had learned were harsh, but they were also invaluable. The Warworlders began to inspect the settlement once more, checking fortifications, supplies, and positions. Their movements were precise and purposeful. Though they did not speak much, their presence conveyed reassurance. The villagers had begun to understand that the Warworlders' focus was not cruelty or dominance, it was survival. Every correction, every adjustment, every command was intended to make the settlement stronger, safer, and more resilient. As the day progressed, the villagers turned their attention to repairing damage caused by the battle. Walls had been breached, gates damaged, and streets littered with debris. Men and women worked side by side, carrying stones, reinforcing structures, and cleaning the streets. The children too young to fight helped in smaller ways, carrying water, running messages, and tending to minor tasks. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone contributed to the recovery. Even as they rebuilt, the emotional toll of the battle was evident. Some villagers struggled to sleep that night, haunted by memories of close calls or the cries of the wounded. Others felt a quiet fear, realizing that even with the Warworlders, danger could return at any time. Yet, amid these fears, a sense of strength had taken root. They had endured, learned, and survived. They had seen themselves act with courage and skill they had not known they possessed. The Warworlders held small sessions with groups of villagers to discuss strategies and improvements. These discussions were not gentle. They were intense and focused. Mistakes from the battle were analyzed, and villagers were taught how to anticipate threats, adjust tactics, and respond more effectively. Though it was challenging, the villagers listened attentively, eager to learn from the experience. The lessons were hard, but the reward was survival. Gradually, the villagers began to reflect on what they had learned, not just about fighting, but about themselves. They realized that the battle had revealed their strengths and weaknesses, both physical and emotional. Fear, once paralyzing, had become awareness. Hesitation had been replaced with confidence. And perhaps most importantly, they had discovered the power of unity. Each person's actions affected everyone else, and together, they could overcome challenges that would have seemed impossible individually. Parents spoke quietly with children, explaining what had happened and emphasizing the importance of courage and cooperation. Elders offered stories of resilience, reminding everyone that survival often depended on adapting to change. Even those who had been skeptical of the Warworlders' harsh methods began to see the value in their guidance. The settlement was not only stronger physically but also mentally and emotionally. The people had grown, and the lessons they had learned would shape them for years to come. Yet there were also difficult truths to face. Some villagers had been deeply affected by the violence they had witnessed. The fear and trauma would not vanish overnight. The Warworlders understood this implicitly, guiding the villagers to channel their emotions into preparation and training rather than despair. The villagers began to develop resilience, learning that while pain and fear were unavoidable, they did not have to define them. Over the following days, the settlement began to stabilize. Injuries were treated, repairs were made, and defenses were strengthened. The villagers had developed routines, each person knowing their role and responsibilities. The Warworlders continued to train them, refine strategies, and monitor readiness. What had once been a community in fear had become a community prepared. The changes were subtle but profound. People walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and carried themselves with purpose. Despite the ongoing recovery, a sense of vigilance remained. The enemy could return at any time, and the settlement could not afford to grow complacent. But the villagers now faced the future with a mixture of caution and confidence. They understood that survival required constant attention, discipline, and cooperation. And they also understood that the Warworlders had not only protected them, but had shown them how to protect themselves. In the quiet moments between work and training, villagers often gathered to reflect on the cost of survival. They spoke of loss, pain, and fear, but also of courage, growth, and the bonds formed during the battle. The experience had changed them. They had been forced to confront their vulnerabilities, but they had emerged stronger. Each villager had learned something valuable, not just about defending the settlement, but about human resilience, unity, and the power of guidance. The Warworlders, ever observant, continued their silent supervision. Their presence was constant but unobtrusive. They did not demand praise, and they did not seek recognition. Their satisfaction came from the growth and readiness of the villagers, and the villagers, in turn, had begun to understand the depth of the Warworlders' commitment. It was not just about winning battles. It was about ensuring the survival and strength of the entire community. By the end of the week, the settlement had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. Walls had been repaired and reinforced, streets had been cleared and organized, and every villager had gained new skills and confidence. Injuries were healing, and spirits, though marked by the trials of battle, were stronger than before. The villagers were not the same people who had sent the desperate call for reinforcements. They were wiser, braver, and more resilient. And yet, the reality of war remained ever present. The plains beyond the settlement were still a place of danger, and the threat of future attacks could never be ignored. The villagers had learned that strength came with responsibility and vigilance. They had discovered the cost of survival, the price of courage, and the importance of preparation. And they had learned that guidance, even when it was harsh or demanding, could transform fear into power. As the sun set over the settlement, Villagers gathered quietly in small groups, reflecting on the lessons learned. The Warworlders watched silently from the edges, their presence a reminder of both the battles fought and the challenges yet to come. The settlement had endured, and the villagers had grown stronger, not just in skill but in spirit. They had faced fear, pain, and uncertainty, and had emerged with a new sense of unity, purpose, and determination. For the villagers, the experience would not be forgotten. The cost of victory was evident, the lessons had been harsh, and the future remained uncertain. But the settlement had survived, and its people had learned what it meant to endure, to fight, and to protect one another. They had asked for reinforcements, and what they had received had done more than defend them. It had changed them forever. The weeks that followed the battles were a time of recovery and reflection for the settlement. Life had begun to return to a new rhythm, one that was quieter yet charged with a sense of purpose. The villagers worked tirelessly to repair damage, strengthen defenses, and rebuild the community. But amid the work, there was also an unspoken understanding. The Warworlders, who had been at their side through every moment of fear and courage, would not remain forever. Their departure had been mentioned in brief exchanges, never directly, but the villagers could feel it in the way the Warworlders moved. They inspected the settlement less frequently, spoke fewer commands, and spent more time observing quietly. It was not abandonment, it was preparation. The Warworlders had taught the villagers everything they could, and soon the people would need to rely on themselves entirely. The realization was both unsettling and empowering. Some villagers felt anxious, afraid that without the Warworlders the enemy could return and overwhelm them. Others felt a spark of confidence, understanding that they had learned skills and strategies that could keep them safe. The lessons of discipline, coordination, and courage were ingrained deeply now, and even the youngest villagers moved with a new awareness of their surroundings and responsibilities. The Warworlders spent their final days overseeing training, reviewing the layout of the settlement, and offering guidance on long-term defense strategies. They worked quietly without fanfare, correcting small mistakes, reinforcing techniques, and ensuring that the villagers were ready for whatever might come. Every exercise, every drill was designed not only to test skill, but also to instill confidence. The villagers began to see themselves as capable, independent defenders rather than dependents waiting for outside help. On the morning of their departure, the Warworlders assembled the villagers in the central square. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, only the quiet presence of these powerful beings who had become both mentors and protectors. The villagers looked at them with a mixture of gratitude, awe, and sadness. These figures had changed their lives, taught them lessons they would carry forever, and now they were leaving. A Warworlder stepped forward, scanning the crowd with sharp, unwavering eyes. Without words, the gesture communicated approval and trust. They had seen growth, courage, and unity, and they knew the villagers were ready. The silent acknowledgement was more powerful than any speech could have been. The villagers understood. Survival and strength were no longer gifts handed to them. They were theirs to claim and defend. As the Warworlders departed, their shadows stretched long across the settlement. The ground seemed to hum with the memory of their presence. Children watched with wide eyes, villagers exchanged quiet words of determination, and elders nodded with approval. The settlement was no longer fragile. It was a fortress of skill, discipline, and unity. The lessons of the Warworlders were etched into every wall, every street, and every heart. In the days and weeks that followed, the villagers began to test themselves. Drills became more complex, simulations more realistic, and coordination sharper. They practiced communicating silently, responding to imagined attacks, and adjusting strategies based on observations. Each success reinforced confidence, and even small failures were met with reflection and learning. The settlement had internalized the guidance of the Warworlders and was now capable of defending itself independently. Life also began to feel normal again, in a new way. Fields were tended, children played, and markets reopened. Yet everything carried a sense of preparedness. Villagers moved with awareness, aware of potential threats and ready to respond. The settlement had become resilient not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. People trusted each other, coordinated as a unit, and understood the importance of vigilance. They had grown beyond the fear that had once defined them. Stories of the battles and the Warworlders' guidance began to circulate. Young and old alike told tales of courage, strategy, and survival. They spoke of moments when fear had almost overwhelmed them, but when unity and discipline had saved the day. These stories were not just reminders of what had happened. They were lessons in themselves, teaching future generations about resilience, preparation, and the strength that comes from working together. The settlement had changed in subtle ways as well. Leaders emerged who had shown skill and courage during the battles. Young fighters grew into capable defenders. Parents felt pride not just in their children's survival, but in the skills and awareness they had developed. Even the children who had once hidden in fear now moved with curiosity and confidence, learning from the examples set by their elders. Over time, the settlement became a symbol of resilience in the wider lands. Travelers, traders, and neighboring communities spoke of the fortified village that had faced overwhelming odds and survived. They marveled not only at the physical defenses but also at the spirit of the people, their unity and their discipline. The Warworlders had left, but their influence remained visible in every aspect of life. Even as the settlement flourished, the villagers remained aware that danger could return at any time. They kept watch over the plains, maintained defenses, and trained daily. Yet the fear that had once paralyzed them was replaced with readiness and confidence. They had learned that strength was built through preparation, cooperation, and courage. They had learned that survival required more than skill. It required heart, determination, and trust in one another. As months passed, the settlement continued to grow stronger. Fields produced more than ever before, trade routes opened safely, and children played freely under the watchful eyes of their elders. Every success was a testament to the lessons learned from the Warworlders and the villagers' own determination to protect and defend their home. They had been transformed not just into survivors, but into a community capable of facing the unknown with courage and unity. The villagers often paused to remember the Warworlders, thinking back on the moments of fear, struggle, and triumph. They realized that the guidance they had received was not a gift, but a challenge, a call to rise above doubt, fear, and uncertainty. They had faced the impossible, learned to fight, and discovered strength within themselves. And even though the Warworlders were gone, their presence remained in every lesson, every strategy, and every action the villagers took. Years later, the story of the Warworlders and the battles they had fought alongside the villagers became a cornerstone of the community's identity. Children learned of the courage required to defend the settlement, the importance of preparation and discipline, and the value of unity. Elders told stories not to scare but to inspire, to remind the next generation that survival required courage, teamwork, and perseverance. The settlement, once fragile and fearful, had become a beacon of resilience. Its people had learned that strength came not only from weapons or walls but from knowledge, discipline, and the courage to face fear head-on. They had learned that guidance, even when strict or demanding, could transform lives and prepare them for challenges they could never have imagined. In the end, the Warworlders had left, but their legacy endured. The villagers had grown into a community capable of defending itself, united not only by necessity but by shared experience, trust, and determination. They had survived battles, endured hardships, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident than they had ever thought possible. And as the sun set over the fortified settlement, casting long shadows across walls and streets, the people stood ready. They had faced fear, loss, and uncertainty, and they had prevailed. The Warworlders had gone, but the lessons they had taught, the courage they had inspired, and the unity they had fostered would remain forever. The settlement was no longer just a home. It was a fortress of resilience, and its people were its greatest defense.